Hello and welcome to the WorkJoy Jam podcast. I'm your host, Beth Stallwood, and I'm really excited to share this episode with you. Today, I'm talking with Alex Lavia, who is a digital wellbeing consultant, and she's the founder of Live Well Offline. And there's some really interesting parts of this conversation, focusing on 3 different areas of our own digital well-being. I'm not going to tell you now what all of those things are. Do have a listen. It's some interesting stuff and some really easy, actually, things that you can do to help you with your own digital well-being, and maybe to think about how you might help the people around you and create the right environment for your team, to be able to have a world where we're able to balance the online stuff with the offline stuff, where the online stuff is more productive. I think a subject that is really, really relevant to us all. Anybody who's working at all remotely, anyone who's working in a hybrid fashion, anybody who is spending a lot of time online, this one is for you. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the WorkJoy Jam podcast. I am very excited today to be joined by Alex Lavia, who is a digital wellbeing consultant, and she's the founder of a really cool organization called Live More Offline. And when I got introduced to Alex, I was like, oh, I need to talk to her. The work you're doing is amazing, and I'm really interested. And some people might be going here listening now, Alex, saying, what is a digital wellbeing consultant? I don't know what that is. So I'm going to hand over to you to do a little intro and maybe tell us a little about what you're doing and your career journey, your story so far that has got you to this place of being the founder of Live More Online. Sorry, Live More Offline. Why am I saying Live More Online? That's the wrong way around. Live More Offline.
Indeed.
So Alex, over to you.
Fabulous. Oh, well, it's so wonderful to be here with you, Beth. And you're right. I mean, gosh, digital well-being is such a new and current challenge for many of us, that we have this challenge, that a lot of the language that we're using, we're defining as we go. So I'll be absolutely delighted to talk through more about, what this actually means in practice. But the kind of things that I help organizations with are very much around video call exhaustion, always on working, feelings of isolation whilst working digitally, and distractions impacting our capacity to focus. So it's all of these ways where digital technology meets human thriving, human well-being, and human potential.
Amazing. And like all of those things you talked about, I'm like, yes, I want to talk about all of those things, because I think they are things that I have not had a single conversation in the last 18 months that hasn't involved at least one of those challenges.
It's amazing. It just brings, they're conversations that bring us all together, because I think so many people have experienced these challenges, that everyone has got a story and a perspective and a real life experience that it can touch into. So
Yeah. So tell us a little bit, Alex, about your journey to get to this. And then we're going to dig into, let's talk more about what this digital wellbeing stuff is and how you might be able to help us all to get that thriving back in our lives.
Absolutely. So I started Live More Offline after noticing the impact of digital habits within my own life. And this started back in my career as a corporate tax accountant. And I started with a large accountancy firm and then moved out into industry. And on the outside, it looked like I had a very successful career. But on the inside, I was actually really struggling with insomnia, stress. And a lot of this came from my constant connection to technology. Back then, it was a BlackBerry phone with that red light flashing. So working in kind of multinational organizations, I'd be, emailing one time zone in the evening, another time zone in the morning. And I didn't realize the impact that digital technology was having at that point. But I found myself with a gap between roles, and I decided to do something really purposeful with that time. So I jumped on a plane, flew to Spain, and spent 34 days walking 500 miles on the Camino de Santiago. And it was on that trail where suddenly all this mental space opened up. I was able to reflect and look back. And I realized or I became curious rather about the impact that digital technology had, both in my personal and in my work life. And that then sparked me when I came back, kind of re-energized, to start a master's degree with the University of Aberdeen, looking at the impact of technology on well-being and how we can create a healthier balance. And then I've spent the last 3 years working with organizations around creating healthier digital cultures. It was really niche before the pandemic.
Yeah, and now so just part of everyday life, right?
That's it. It's right at the heart of the future of work conversations.
Yeah, amazing. And it's so funny because when you were just sitting there, sometimes songs start playing in my head, and you were talking about walking 500 miles, and I was just thinking, oh, about the Proclaimers, and I would walk 500 miles, and I would walk 500 more, and sitting there thinking, oh, what an amazing thing to do, and to allow yourself that space to kind of really open up your mind and think about what is it that what you're recognizing in yourself and how you might be able to change some of that.
And that mental space is something we do lose in the digitally distracted age. So it's quite, it ties in with the theme as well, to have that experience of really noticing what happens
Yeah.
to your clarity of thinking in a space like that.
Yeah. And that whole, I don't think it's on any kind of standard career path guidance, is it, that you go from being a corporate tax accountant to being a digital wellbeing consultant? I've not heard of that transition myself before.
No, me neither.
You're paving the way for a whole new way of thinking about doing things. So there's so many things I want to kind of go into. The first one is this idea around, mental space and what's happening in our world. And I just wonder if you could give us a little bit of an overview as to some of the challenges. I mean, you've said a few of them already, but maybe a bit more detail. Some of the challenges that some of these things are great, aren't they? The digital world, how it's opened up things, how it gives more flexibility and all kinds of things. But what is the other side of that? What's the negative side? What's the stuff that people are finding really difficult?
Absolutely. And that's a great question, and really points to the fact that it's not black and white. So,
Yeah,
digital technology is a real force for good. And actually, it's the organizations that harness technology in the best ways, that have undergone this digital transformation, that will be set up to succeed in a digital future. But the challenge comes when we're not then intentional with the ways that we're using technology from a
yeah,
human perspective. And at Live More Flying, all our work is based around 3 pillars, because the conversation is bigger than well-being. So it's digital productivity,
yeah,
digital well-being, and virtual connection. So in terms of what are the unintended downsides, if we're not intentional, then from a productivity perspective, working in that digitally distracted environment where we've got constant pings and notifications, reduced focus time, has an impact on our productivity, focus, accuracy, creativity. And then well-being perspective, we're having real challenges at the moment with burnout. And there was a survey by Buffer about looking into the struggles of remote workers. And what they found was that the number one challenge for remote workers since the pandemic has been not being able to switch off. And so
yeah,
that's another key aspect of creating balance with technology. And the third pillar is around virtual connection. So, in this time where we're having to connect over digital platforms, if we're not intentional about layering in human connection touch points, then we end up feeling that sense of disconnection and remote isolation. But there is a lot that we can do in that space to feel more connected whilst working
mm,
digitally. So they're the three areas really that we look at Live More Offline.
amazing. I'm going to dig into each of them because I think each of them have their own place and are really interesting for what we can do. And one of the things
Mm.
that I often talk about when it comes to work joy and thinking about like how do you get more joy in your working life and in your life in general is the bit about personal accountability, the personal responsibility stuff. And I'm really interested about this because what you're talking about is about how we do this intentionally rather than just gets kind of, I think, rather than just get stuck into a pattern that isn't very helpful for us, or get stuck thinking that we have to do things. And it'd be really interesting as we talk through this stuff to think about, actually, as an individual, what are we empowered, what can we do for ourselves to help us in this world, because we
Mm.
can't always rely on our organizations to have the answer. And I also think that organizations, when they create an answer, often create kind of like a policy based answer, or a here's one size fits all, when the world, I don't think, really works like that. And I think we all have a slightly different tolerance to stuff and a different resilience to some of these things as well.
I think there's so much truth to that. So really connecting into what it is that you want to make happen in your life, and then having that intention. So much of our behaviour is habitual, and actually we just do a particular behaviour in response to a trigger. So it could be an email pops in, notification comes up, we check the email. We don't necessarily think. Well, we don't think at that point once it's become a habit, and we don't notice whether actually there was something better we could have experienced, which might have
Mm,
been the capacity to focus. But at the same time, there's so much to be said about teams being accountable to, and creating those conditions. And at
yeah,
Live More Offline, we really make sure that through all of our programs, we're working at both of those levels, the team level and the individual level. And as
yeah,
you say, making sure that individual is accountable, but from an organizational level, doing what it is that you can do to create the conditions that
yeah,
actually enable that individual to be able to make the choices that they
yeah.
want to make.
Amazing. So let's dig in. Let's go deep for a minute. Let's get in here. Let's talk about the distraction stuff. Let's talk
Hmm.
about this, how easy it is to not be able to get that focus, that flow, because of how digital technology, when it's not set up in an optimal way, works for us. What are you seeing and observing, and maybe even what are some of the things that we could do about those things?
Yeah, sure. So it's really interesting how, when we look ahead into the skills that are needed in the digital future of work, actually, as technology automates more of the routine work that we do, then the skills that we need are more of the higher level cognitive skills like focus, creativity.
Yeah.
And the World Economic Forum has said that 50% of our people need to be reskilled by 2025 in order to take this into consideration. But at the same time that those skills are becoming more important, they're actually harder to do. So it's
Yeah.
yeah,
It's like, I know we need this, and we haven't actually got that long to make this happen if we need it by 2025, but it's getting harder every day.
that's it. Like the number of Teams chat messages increased, I think, 148% during the lockdown. So if we're constantly being pinged and dinged, and we don't have structures in place around how we're communicating within teams, then we'll never be able to step back to actually be able to focus. And our brain is like a muscle. What we practice, we get stronger at. So the more that we practice distraction, the more distractible we become as
Mm,
well. So it's absolutely vital. I've been doing work with early careers teams, and that's another great place, kind of starting right at the beginning of people's
yeah.
careers with those sustainable habits that really help performance.
And in this world of the kind of pings and dings and things, what are some of the the
I love it.
practical things that I love it too. There's going to definitely be some kind of pings and dings thing going on here. What are some of the practical things that we could do as individuals, or within our teams, that might help us to stop those things getting in our way of productivity, in our way of being great and focused in the things that we need to get done?
Yeah, so many of our technology applications have settings that we can change to set them up in the way in which we want them to be. So we don't have to accept those defaults. And if you're ever finding yourself thinking, "Gosh, I wish that I didn't have so many email notifications popping up," there will be a way within the settings that you can change that. So there are some things, that are kind of universally quite helpful, which are removing that pop-up box in the bottom right-hand corner of your
Yeah.
screen on Outlook. So you can change that. You can remove the sound of messages as they come in. One thing that I have is that my incoming emails make no sound, but if it's an urgent email, it does make a sound. So people know that actually I'm more likely to pick it up if it is actually urgent. And I quite like that as a bit of a nuanced
Yeah.
approach. But then working in batches is key. So allowing yourself a 45-minute, focused period of time, and then going to your emails or your other kind of shorter tasks. And what I quite like to do there is gamifying it. So setting a timer for 25 minutes and then seeing how much you can get through in those 25 minutes of the more kind of routine tasks, and then go back to something that requires focus. And I think when you're keeping it rewarding, you're more likely to do it.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I'm thinking here about that first thing you said about actually, if it's marked as an urgent email, it pings for me. Is this not all emails are created equal, right? They're not all as important as each other. But when you have that constant pinging or the kind of constant like looking on your screen, you can see it. It makes it feel like they are all something you have to go and deal with right away.
Absolutely. And there's one question that I asked to a lot of people: of every 30 emails you receive, how many of them are actually urgent and require a response within 30 minutes? And if the answer there is two, three, or more, then chances are that you will check every email of those 30 just to make sure they're not the urgent ones. So what can we do there? In two areas: one, reducing the volume of unnecessary email in the first place, but secondly, reducing the number of urgent emails through
Mm,
changing the ways we work.
yeah. Oh, so interesting. And like simple things, but it's that kind of thing that to change the settings on your emails or on your notifications for whatever it is, it's probably one of those activities that would take like 10 minutes. But actually sitting down and doing it is hard. It's harder than the 10 minutes it would take, right? Because it doesn't take that long. It's the kind of knowledge that you need to go and do this and the action to really make it happen to help yourself that often doesn't get done.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, it's so many things in life where it just takes us a little bit of time up front and saves so much
Yeah.
time in the future. And I try to make things as easy as possible for kind of people attending my talks or training, and providing straight after, summary of those steps you can do straight away, showing you where in Outlook you can go to make it happen.
Yeah, and actually, I've done some of this, and it's not that difficult. It really
No.
isn't. You do not need to be a computer programmer. It's just, I think this is an interesting one, maybe for the digital industry, is the default settings are the distraction ones, like on
Mm.
everything. It's almost like you always have to go and turn the distraction things off. And I
Mm.
wonder, and again, maybe there's a campaign in this, Alex, for you, is there something about actually campaigning for the distractions to be off to start with, and you turn them on if you want them?
I really like that. I like that. I think certainly making it trying to make a step there when you first use an application that
Mm,
really gets you to think about what it is that you want those settings to be. But I mean, you're absolutely right. There's so much evidence around, I think, organ donation, with
yeah,
those countries that have an automatic opt-in, have a much higher level of adoption than countries where you have to opt in for organ donation. So those default settings make a significant difference.
yeah, and it's really interesting because we have Club WorkJoy, which is a kind of platform, and it is a digital platform where we share stuff, and we have a great community of people on there, and we do events and things. And one of the first things, my first video that people get when they join is, here's how to turn all your notifications off. Otherwise, it will bombard you, and it will be really annoying, and you won't enjoy it. So there is something
Fabulous.
here about I can't think of a single program, app I use that I haven't had to go and do something with to not be bombarded with information from them.
Oh, that is absolutely brilliant. And it is great. It actually can be quite nuanced as well. So for instance, in WhatsApp, if you've just got particular groups that are really noisy, you can just mute those particular groups as well. And so also kind of looking within these applications, and it's not all or nothing as well. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Love it. So that's a kind of a really great thing around the distraction side of things, around the productivity. How do we make it work? Let's go into this one, which I think it's big right now, right? There's a lot of people who are at that stage of obviously what we call burnout, or feeling really like just generally knackered from the world of digital, thinking
Mm.
about this side of the well-being stuff. Tell me more about this and how we might be able to tackle some of this, um the lack of energy and the kind of depletion of our energy that's been happening.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's so important right now. There's a recent survey showed that 82% of leaders were at burnout risk, which I thought was quite incredible.
Mm,
But we're hearing more and more within, when I'm speaking with my clients, what's coming out of their pulse surveys is around burnout and exhaustion as well. And it makes sense when we look at, for instance, the number of video calls that we are having. They really jumped up at the start of lockdown, but they haven't dropped. Microsoft data showed they've just continued to trend upwards. So when you have one of those days where you're in your sixth back-to-back video call, it is cognitively draining, and video calls are more exhausting mentally than phone calls. So again, it's taking that nuanced approach. How can you and as a team pick the right tool for the right job? So not every call has to be a video call. But the other big one is this blurred boundaries and difficulties to disconnect. And I think that's where the future of remote work really needs us to pull together to be able to create healthy conditions for our employees to be able to thrive at work. Because if we
yeah.
can't psychologically disconnect, then it is a one-way trip towards exhaustion, stress, anxiety, and burnout.
Yeah. And I'm going to take the first one. And is there a reason why, and I'd love it if you know this, because like into the psychology of it all, why the video calls are much more exhausting than either a phone call or even a real in-person human to human
Mm.
meeting? What is it that drives that?
Indeed. I think it's because it's a really strange environment for our
Mm,
brains. So there's a bit of cognitive dissonance almost, where there's a bit of a time lag at times between the movement we're seeing and the sound that we're hearing.
yeah.
We're seeing people in a really strange environment where we're just seeing them neck upwards, but our human brain is expecting to see a whole person and the body language, all the cues that come with that. So instead, of having a lot of this information that we take in quite naturally in terms of body language and cadence, what we instead get is a bit of a hyper focus onto the bits that we can see, which is kind of the visuals on a screen,
Mm,
but our brain is also trying to figure out, well, why does this look a little bit odd at the
yeah.
same
It's
time?
like I always
So
find it strange. I'm seeing people's faces, but I'm not making eye contact. That for me is one of the
mm,
weirdest things I think about online video calls. But it's a really interesting one because people say, "Oh, swap to a phone call." But I personally, and there are many people with lots of different, preferences and needs, aren't there? But for me personally, I find it really hard to hear and understand people on a phone call versus um a seeing people. So there's that whole balance of individual needs and the what's working, what's not working. And I think one of the challenges is it's not necessarily that we're doing digital things, it's how many things we're doing in a day, right? It's the back to back, no rest for our brain thing that has an extra impact.
Absolutely. And that back to back nature, I think Microsoft released some research that just showed the benefit of 5-minute breaks between calls. And
Yeah.
they had participants' brain scans, and it showed the reduction in stress if you just had that 5-minute break between calls. But so you're absolutely right. It's that number of calls that are just filling up our
Yeah.
diaries, and sometimes they're just there because we feel like that's what we're supposed to do in order to show that we're working. But there
Yeah.
are yeah, if we hold this video call and we have a conversation and we end the call, then we have done half an hour of work. But if
Yeah.
you haven't structured it, taken actions, and held an effective meeting, then you're not being as productive. So
Mm,
there is a lot of ways that you can use asynchronous working to actually be more effective, efficient, and shorten meetings at the same
yeah.
time.
And it's that digital presenteeism, isn't it? It's like, oh, I'm here on this call, but is
Mm.
it purposeful? And it's like, it's the same thing that's been going on actually, isn't it, for years around, should I be in this meeting or not? The same question keeps coming around. It's just that we've added in extra stress for ourselves and our brains by making it an online thing versus an in-person thing.
Absolutely. Yes.
And so thinking about this, some of the things that I've heard people doing, which I think are really great ideas, is to kind of, if you would normally have done a half an hour meeting, do a 25-minute meeting. So you've got a 5 minutes between them. If, the 50-minute versus an hour. And
Mm.
I think a lot of people are getting into that zone. But then the other thing is, a lot of people aren't in control of their own diary. Like, people are inviting them to things where it's someone else who maybe doesn't have the same idea about good digital practice. And
Yes.
that's a hard one, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's where you really have to have the team culture bought
Yeah.
into these balanced working practices, and it's two sides. So it's the awareness raising across a team as a whole, but then working in particular with people managers, really making them catalysts for change, because they often do own the culture and the dynamics and the norms
Yeah.
within a team, and kind of having them lead by example, and is great. And there's the Mindful Business Charter is a great document to check out if you're
Ooh,
wanting to get an idea of the types of principles you could sign up to. So that's something that was set up by Pinsent Masons, Adelshaw, Goddard, and Barclays Bank, and it sets out principles of ways that teams will work together to humanize the workplace.
amazing. What we'll do is we'll pop a link in the show notes to that as well, because it'd be interesting for people to go and have a read and explore some of the great stuff that's out there. And that's an interesting, isn't it? There are lots of resources that are coming to the fore now about all of these different things. But the challenge again, I think, is that people are so busy doing the work or being on the calls that the time to be mindful and really think about some of this stuff just disappears sometimes. And the thing I'm thinking about in my head is, obviously you had this amazing experience where you went and walked for 500 miles. Well done. You must have had very sore feet after that, to go and do it. But you don't need to take 3 weeks and walk 500 miles to give yourself a bit of a space to do it, do you? It can be smaller than that.
It can be much smaller than that. Absolutely, absolutely. And you're right as well about the fact that it's hard to keep up to date with these changing times as well. I mean, I work in this area full time, and I still kind of learning something new every day.
Mm,
So I think our leaders are so, they've got their hands full already trying to do a day job, looking after and really caring for the well-being of their people, which I think is becoming an even greater proportion of
yeah.
their time, that knowing the strategy around how to do hybrid well is not something we can really expect them just to pick up. We actually
Yeah.
need to support them as well.
Yeah, and as you say, if you're working this full time and it's hard to keep up, imagine how hard that is for people who are doing different jobs and trying to do it well as
Mm.
well. And it's so, one of the things I find really fascinating, and I've had a bit of a rant about this before on things like LinkedIn around hybrid, is there's loads of people saying, we know how to do hybrid, we're going hybrid. And hardly anyone can actually tell me what that really means for them. What does it really mean? How is it going to work? How is it going to work really well? And my advice to people has been, don't set out things in too strict a way. Like, experiment with some stuff, see what works, because although that hybrid often then gets translated into, well, we'll be in the office 3 days a week or out of the office 3 days a week or whichever, it comes about where you are versus how you do it, and how you the conversation I think needs to be more around, how do we do this stuff well? And you talk about it's like really well intentioned and having the right focus and the right, what you're noticing about stuff and all of that stuff doesn't necessarily come into the conversation that often.
I love that. And there's, I think, a really interesting article, maybe about a year ago by, I think it was David D'Souza from CIPD, and he used the kind of expression that you said there about it being a time for experiments, not
Yeah.
decisions. And so many people feel in a time of uncertainty, they have to nail their kind of flag to the mast and say, this is what we're doing. And then that's bold leadership. But actually a lot of us were feeling our way into this, and so it's making, and actually it's maybe setting that as a clear intention to our teams that we're working together as an experiment. We try something, we then gather the feedback from our organizations to whether that's working, and then we iterate and we do another tweak, and we're always learning from the feedback that we're receiving. And I think that's a really, really positive way of approaching this, rather than feeling that pressure to say at the outset a definitive policy of how we're going to work.
And I think there's also a need for us all to be really mindful that everybody's worlds are different, and the idea that we're all in the same situation and that we can all do things in a certain way is just not really how human beings work. Everyone has different home lives, different things they need to do, different priorities, different levels of resilience and ability to do things in a certain way at a certain time. And yeah, so I think I think your
Yes.
world and the things you're working on are going to become more and more needed as, even if these organizations have made bold statements on what it's going to be, it's like, okay, well, now we've said what we're going to do. How are we actually going to make that work for everyone? How is this really going to be our culture? What does that look like in this new world? So many things to think about. And then the third thing we were talking about there, so on your wonderful list of things to focus on, was all around this kind of the human connection stuff. And I'd love to hear more about actually how do we make that side of things work as well.
Yeah, sure. So, Live More Flying, we frame this around there being four principles of meaningful human connection online. But the ethos behind it is that when we're working virtually, what we need is lots of little touch points. We will never get the same feeling of connection as we do in one big go as we would if we're sat
Mm,
face to face, next to somebody else. But actually, if we've got that cadence, that regularity, and we've got those small touch points, then it does build up, and we can develop some deep sense of belonging and connection. So yeah, I think the four principles are around, and it's kind of from an evidence base. One-to-ones really impact how connected people feel
yeah.
within their organizations. Making your socials more meaningful and centering them around a sense of purpose instead of say just a Zoom happy hour, but actually rather, could it be things like walking challenges, say, which I've heard teams using to great effect, really kind of pulling together and having a lot of banter around, say, which team can walk from the London to the Sydney office the fastest,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but yeah, and then kind of strengthening networks
Yeah.
is absolutely vital, and making sure that people gain the feedback that is so easy to lose in the digital environment as well. Is when we're sat at home, we send off a report, and then we're just sat there in the void of our room, and we don't know whether what we've produced is good enough. Yeah, it's absolutely vital from
Yeah.
especially early careers to try to humanize that, and to intentionally put those touch points of feedback and connection and discussion
Mm.
within there.
It's really interesting you talk about the kind of those smaller moments and being able to have some regularity and some consistency to those. Because when I talk to organizations quite a lot and different subjects, but I talk quite a lot about culture change and how are you going to create the culture that you're looking for. And one of the things I always say to organizations is before it becomes part of your culture, you almost have to make it quite a formal thing. You have to actually book these things in. Like if you want people to have more feedback conversations, just saying we want you to have more feedback conversations probably isn't going to do it.
Mm.
Booking in 3 10-minute one-to-ones a week that gives you that opportunity to do the what you would have done just going up to someone's desk and saying, can I just grab you for 5 minutes, will help make that happen. And then until it just becomes part of your normal, regular rhythm and cadence of what you're doing. But it won't, I always think digitally, it probably won't happen unless you're scheduling it and
Oh,
making it a formal
absolutely.
part of what you do.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, definitely. Scheduling into the diary makes all the difference. You've made that commitment.
Yeah. And it's weird, isn't it? Because it's all of the human bits of life that you would never really schedule. We're now having to think about scheduling, so that, turning around to your boss's desk and saying, "Can I just check with you? Am I doing this in the right way?" Or the kind of coffee jump into a conversation when you're at the water machine, or the walking down the corridor, just saying hi to someone and checking in on how their real life is versus how their work is. I think for me, that's the thing that got really, really lost
Yeah.
in the digital world. And it's very hard to replicate the situation. But what we could do is to find a space to have the same conversation.
And I think it's so important because there's talk of this great resignation at the moment. But when I'm speaking with organizations, what I'm hearing is that their staff turnover is actually much higher in the people that have been with their organizations for only a year. And
Yeah.
that's the people that have onboarded remotely and worked remotely. And the feedback is, well, I don't feel that connected with my team. And this other company's offered me a higher salary. So why wouldn't I,
Yeah.
move? And these remote workers, well, in remote working, we're so much more mobile now.
Yeah. Definitely. And I can imagine that, it's a really hard thing to onboard remotely, right? That's a difficult thing to do. There were
Mm,
people who've been working in organizations for, a year and a half, who have never met any of their teammates in person.
mm.
And I kind of get that's not a completely unique thing, because teams who've worked globally have often been in that situation. But it's a really hard one, isn't it? And it takes longer, I believe. And I'm going to say that I have no evidence for this. I think it does take longer for you to build those really good relationships when you're doing it online versus when you have that in-person human connection.
I think so. But then at times I've been really surprised and I think it might be the difference between the one-to-one and the group dynamics. I think the group
Yeah.
dynamics online, it's really hard to form a connection to a series of kind of boxes on a
Yeah.
screen. But I've had some people that I started working with during the pandemic and other partners, and I have been so surprised. I then met them in real life 12 months later, and it felt like we'd known each other forever.
Yeah.
We had managed to create that sense of connection. So it's all about, well, what does work and what doesn't work in the online environment. And I think you're right that for organizations it is a real challenge. It's hard, but it takes intentionality. It takes kind of factoring all these aspects into the onboarding process and having those intentional ways that you're embedding human connection into digital work.
Yeah. And I love how much we've talked about that intent. It's actually that, let's spend a little bit of time thinking about this rather than just doing everything as we've always done it. Because if we are struggling with anything like burnout or exhaustion or disconnection or any of the things we've talked about today, that they're not going to suddenly miraculously fix themselves. There is no there is no magic wand cure for this stuff. We're
Mm.
actually going to have to do some work and think about it and talk about it and notice things and change some of our own or some of our team behaviors if we want that to change. It's not just going to
Mm.
magically fix itself.
Absolutely, and change is hard. It takes a
Mm.
lot of momentum to
Yeah.
initially shift direction, but once you've made that change, then it takes on a momentum of its own.
Yeah. Amazing. I am going to move us on now because we're going to need to go on to our quick fire questions. Thank you so much for talking through those three really important areas. And I'm sure people can get in touch with you and talk more about these stuff. But let me crack on, if you're okay, to go
Yeah.
through some questions. So, talking about work joy, let's bring it back to that and kind of the joy of work. What for you personally is always guaranteed to bring you a little bit of work joy?
So for me, it's definitely time outside, whether that is a walking meeting or actually, kind of a walk and think. Definitely having, or even a break,
Yeah.
time outside makes all the difference.
Yeah. It's like asking the kid, like, what's your favorite bit of school? It's like break time. It's like, yes, love that. I personally love it when kids say, like, what's your favorite lesson? It's like break time or lunchtime. It's like, yeah, because that's where you get all the fun bits of time going. But there is something about actually, and I know I did it. I've been trying to religiously do it. It's so easy to get stuck in a room and online for the
Yes,
entire day. And now that we're coming, well, when this comes out, yeah, we'll still be in winter. Now that it's dark in the mornings and dark in the evenings, trying to get out during the day when there's actually still some daylight versus being dark and dingy and then in the house in front of a computer all day is definitely something I've been trying to do more and more of. So yeah,
absolutely.
amazing one. What book are you currently reading?
So I've gone back to digital productivity again recently. So I'm looking at Cal Newport's A World Without Email, which
Oh,
is absolutely brilliant. It's his latest book, and looking actually at how we can do some really innovative things with the way in which we're working to just reduce the volume of these digital distractions at the outset, through smarter working.
oh,
And I think
love
it's a
that.
fascinating book, actually.
It's really interesting as well. When I think about people I've worked with, is some of the people who I've worked with who have got really what I would call good balance between how they focus their time and how they don't get distracted. Some of those people it grew up in a world where email wasn't the main source of communication, and
Mm.
they're able to say, well, I'll look at my emails here, because they weren't in the world of, well, you always have to be looking at your emails. And that whole, do we really need them? It's almost like email is one of like the best and the worst inventions of all time, right? It's like it's
Mm.
so brilliant in some ways and so terrible in others. But oh, sounds great. I'm gonna have to get on and order that one and give that a little read. Next question. What is the best or most useful bit of advice that someone has given you in your life that you always find yourself coming back to?
Yeah, so this was at the point where I was doing soul searching around my corporate career. And I was just chatting to someone actually at a meditation retreat, and they said to me, it doesn't have to be that way. And there was just something about those words that just hit right into the heart of me. And it's like a kind of a realization of, oh gosh, it doesn't have to be that way.
No.
And that really guides everything that I do throughout my business now. With all of these things, the amount of email we're receiving, all the back-to-back video calls, it doesn't have to be that way. We've got, opportunities, we've got power to be able to make change. And I think just starting with those words, suddenly you feel so much more empowered. And the question just becomes, well, how? How do I
Yeah.
find the other way?
Yeah, and even if it's 10% better, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, but
Mm.
those little steps can really make a big difference. I love that question. It doesn't have to be that way. So how else could it be? Like, what would be better than the way we're doing it right now? It opens
Yeah.
up that real opportunity to change. I love it.
Completely agree with you that small change is much more lasting as well.
Yeah.
So,
It's
yes.
also it's like the whole like New Year's resolution versus actually doing something. Like do something small and easy to do until it becomes a habit, and then build and build and build from there. I love that as
Mm.
a way of making change happen. Right, here we go. This is a big one. What is one super practical bit of advice to our listeners, which is something that they could actually physically go and do like now or do tomorrow or the next day and kind of keep it working, that would help them in their world, in their digital world, and to help them get some more work joy?
Okay. So, I a strong believer that everything is personalized and all our challenges are different.
Yeah,
As a catch-all, I would want to say check your notifications and disable any ones that you don't that they're not actually helping you, that they're just a distraction. But from an individualized perspective, I think I would say step back and just think, where is the one place in my life that I am out of digital balance? Like,
yeah,
where is it? And we often have that gut feel. And then at that point, look at, well, using that guiding question, it doesn't have to be that way. So, what change could you make that would make that 10% better?
yeah. Love that. So actually, it's almost just like taking stock, isn't it, and stopping and kind of going right. Maybe it's going outside, going for a walk, and putting that question in your head, like, where is it out of balance? What is not quite right here? And what could I do about that?
Yeah, often we don't stop to think, and then weeks and months fly by, and we're continuing with habits which actually we do know would make a big difference if we could change them. So just that very act of stopping and thinking can make a big difference.
Yeah, love it. So final question from me is, where can people find out more about you, Alex, and about your amazing work and about Live More Offline?
Oh, brilliant. Well, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, which is actually Alessandra Livia with a double S, or on our website, www.livemoreoffline.com. And we list out there the work that we do around awareness raising talks, workshops, and also our signature 8-week leadership in a digital age course. So I'd be
Brilliant.
delighted to discuss further.
And we'll pop those links into the show notes as well so that people can click on straight through. Alex, thanks so much for joining me today, for sharing some of your really great thinking and practical advice around some of these areas. I think it's going to be a continuing challenge for everybody. And I love the idea that we can all kind of take a little bit of responsibility for our own and to think about, as a team, how do we create that right environment to make these things better for everybody in a way that works for individuals, because you're right, we don't all fit into exactly the same nice neat boxes around, oh, if we do this everything will be fine, because it doesn't work like that, because this is real life we're talking about. So thank you so much for being a guest on the WorkJoy Jam.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Beth. It's an absolute pleasure to have been here.
Well, a huge thank you to Alex for coming on the WorkJoy Jam podcast. So many great little bits and nuggets of things that we can do. I think for me, this making sure we spend some time considering where things are balanced, where they're out of balance, where there's that out of kilter thing and you think, yeah, I'm exhausted maybe from back-to-back calls, or the notifications are distracting me with my focus time, to really actually stop and think and consider what's the small action I could take to make that 10% better. That for me would be my real takeaway, is not to get stuck in the habits that aren't helping us, but just to stop and consider what else we can do. I really loved talking to Alex, so thank you so much, Alex, for joining us, and we will pop all of those bits and pieces about how you can get in contact with Alex, her website, and some of the things she mentioned into the show notes. So do go and have a look on those and click on those if you would like more information. If you are loving what we're talking about on WorkJoy, remember that we have Club WorkJoy, which is a community of people who are all working towards creating and cultivating more joy in their working life. We have monthly guest speakers, we have an app where I tell everyone to turn the notifications off straight away, so don't worry, we're doing hopefully a good digital world there, where we support each other on questions, and people ask me questions every week and I do little videos for their answers. We have networking sessions and all kinds of great things to be part of. So if you're interested to hear more, you can find out more at clubworkjoy.com and sign up to come and be part of our wonderful community of brilliant people. Thank you so much for listening to the WorkJoy Jam. We have a number of episodes. This is season 4 we're working on now. So do go and have a listen to other things that you might find really interesting. Thanks so much and have a great week.